And what were your first impressions of UEA when you arrived?
Well, one has to understand that the physical arrangements of the university were very different to what they are today. We're talking about 300 students. So it was actually substantially smaller than the school I came from. The whole of the academic setup was in the temporary buildings that had been put up in the area that we still know as University Village, but that was the whole academic campus there. And of course the buildings there are new residential ones which we subsequently built. But the idea was that the temporary buildings would be there for 10 years or so. I think they stayed for 30. And their successor types, of course, have now reappeared again in terms of the Chancellor's Drive Annex. And so it's quite ironic that one sort of, for teaching purposes, now ending up in types of buildings that one was taught in one's undergraduate days, equivalent thereof. And the other thing was the residences. And the residences then were at Pfeiffer's Lane, and they were an ex-RAF officers' accommodation, basically. Which again the university sort of hired. And the reason for that was that Frank Thistlethwaite, who was the first Vice Chancellor, he wanted to get UEA off the ground quickly because he was very conscious of competing with other people who were setting up the other universities at Lancaster, Sussex, Kent, etc. And one or two of them were about a year or 2 years ahead of UEA. So the temporary buildings were a way of getting students in, competing in the market, as it were, I think before the whole, concrete started being poured. So in that sense, my impression was of really everything was fresh and new, because there had just been 2 years of students before, and the year I came was the first year that we had these converted buildings at Pfeiffer's Lane, the Pfeiffer's Lane residences, which ironically many decades later, I remember the Dean of Students offering them to me and saying, we want you to go and, because you would have resident members of faculty to oversee the residents in that case. Vic, it could be your fiefdom. And it's one of the 3 jobs in the university which I know I deliberately turned down because there was too much of my life going to disappear into those things. But I didn't do that. But and then the other thing you've got to think about, I suppose, is that quite a lot of the faculty were fairly young. Nowadays it's in the nature of things that you've got lots of wrinklies like me around the place, as it were. And they're fairly juvenile wrinklies in my case. Many of the faculty, particularly on the literature side, were pretty young. I mean, they were only 4 or 5 years older than we were. But even with the somewhat older faculty, the senior professors who had been appointed, I mean, they were in their 30s, really. I think, if I think now, must have been. Although, of course, anyone in their 30s to anyone in their late teens looks pretty ancient anyway. But there was an excitement and dynamism, and we would, something new was being done, as it were, and things were being done in new ways.